When it comes to painting black armor, we generally only get two options. One, edge highlight everything, which that sucks. And two, non-metallic metal, which that can be difficult. And look, this is basically non-metallic metal, but easier. Thanks to the Army Painter, we're going to be giving away this big bastard, the Fanatics Wargamer set, but you'll find out more about that later in the video. Seems like every time I do a video I get a little bit better and a little bit worse, because I didn't tell you that we're doing iridescent black. And while this, yes, is in the form of non-metallic metal, this is an easier version, as I mentioned in the intro, because every time we step up into highlights, we're going to be changing the color. And with those separations of colors and layers, hopefully it's easier to break down for you guys to see what the actual non-metallic metal or the volumetric highlighting techniques are. To start with, you may have noticed that we've pulled out some deep ocean blue. And other than the black, this is going to be the deepest, darkest color. Now, the hard thing with the black is we're going to have to try and make the deepest color possible in paints to look like the mid-tone. So what we're going to be focusing on here is kind of just building up the reflections. Next up is the Imperial Navy. Now, I'm just using this to paint inside the last layer that we painted. Just like the Neon Grim style that we covered a little while ago, all I'm doing here is basically plotting out where I want the reflections and the highlights, and then painting the next color or the next layer inside of that first one. This is how we're building up our gradients, but the other trick to this is thinning down your paints. Because I'm not glazing and I'm not going to be wet blending, what I'm going to do is thin down the paints just a little bit further than I usually would. So these are typically 50-50, 1 drop of water to 1 drop of paint. Scarab green might feel like a weird color, but because we're going for that iridescent oil slick look, we do need to bring in some other colors to give it a little bit of life. Things like blues, pinks, purples, greens, and we are going to be busting out a yellow. From Scarab Green and onwards, I'm not covering the exact same spots as before. I'm really just going for the highlights, just to give us that little bit of a transition between the blue to the green and now into a deep azure, which that's a fun word to say, azure. Since we are getting quite bright now, these are our highlights. So you want to kind of focus these on the parts that would be getting the most intense light. And yes, I started with the leg again, but it's honestly the easiest thing to show you, especially on a model like this. And trust me, with techniques like non-metallic metal or iridescence, what I'm doing here, it's a lot easier to focus on one section at a time. Now I have the main highlight sketched in, and we're going to shift over to purple. Terrestrial Titan is going to be our deepest, darkest base for this. Because we're going for that iridescent color shift feel, we do have to include something just a little bit different. So the placement for purples in a scheme like this is basically the undersides, or what would actually be in the shadows. Metallics don't actually have a shadow, they just have something else that they're reflecting. And color shift kind of makes it a little bit more difficult with placement, so what I'm going to do is just make sure there's an even distribution. Anywhere that would typically be a shadow, that's where I'm going to be painting in the purple and now the Diabolic Plum. But because these are supposed to be quote-unquote shadow reflections, we're not going to build them up quite as high in the highlights. A little bit of ice yellow in there is really going to do it, and then we're just going to add a touch more for the highest highlight. Now, here's the cool thing with the paint job about this. Because it does have so many different colors, but it's all the same technique, you're going to get used to it pretty quickly, and then you'll be able to apply different colors and different schemes to it. For example, if you liked this a lot better before we started adding purples in here, don't add the purples in. The original gradient of blue to green into turquoise is really cool. And honestly, I'd probably use that as a basic non-metallic metal black. It's cold, it's shiny, and it still has a lot of darkness to it. Here's where things start to get wild. Into all those highlights on the teal, I'm going to go in with a little bit of demonic yellow. And same thing, 1 drop of water, 1 drop of paint. It's not quite a glaze, but it's also not a full-blown bottle-ready thickness. Why am I doing this? Honestly, it just looks cool. Heating up some of these highlights and shifting it into a direction that you wouldn't think of, that's what makes the iridescence feel. Because after this, I'm also going to go back in with ice yellow and just spectrally highlight all the yellow parts. Alright, I said we're going to give away some paint. Let's give away some paint. The Fanatic Wargamers set comes with 102 paints, it's got a paintbrush, and you even get a big ass dragon. When the Army Painter put these Fanatic boxes together, they try as hard as they can to not overlap in any paint, so you can take those gradual steps up, and with this as a start, well, you can't complain. But by now, you should figure out we're not like most other channels. We're not going to make a competition where you have to like, subscribe, or even paint anything. All I want is for you guys to flood the comments with dad jokes. But there are some limitations on that. Nothing racist, nothing sexist, nothing homophobic. Jokes about redheads are encouraged. And that's it. That's all you have to do. Come up with a dad joke. In 2 weeks' time from the release of this video, we'll go through the list, find the best jokes, and basically send somebody a message saying that I've got to send them like 10 kilos worth of paint. And even though shipping from Australia sucks, this is open worldwide. Harry man, we care not for your giveaway. Back to the painting. For the rest of the model, we're going to take these same steps, this same recipe, and apply it to all the different shapes. One thing that I've learned with non-metallic metals, especially when you're going to start introducing a color shift or an iridescence, something that I do quite frequently is I like to have a line that draws the interest. Some people would call that a focal point. But because I'm not having it as an actual focal point towards the head or a detail that I really want people to look at, that's not what it is. When we tip this model back the other way, you're going to see from that first leg that we did all the way up through the chest and then to a spot on the helmet when we get to the end of the video, you'll see what I mean by creating a line of focus. And then once you have that all together, it's a lot easier to start building and creating balance between all of your other highlights. And as far as I'm concerned, balance of composition is one of the most overlooked aspects of miniature painting. If you want to hit those like and subscribe buttons, go for it. But if you want to take another step, in the description you'll find links to the Patreon where there's a few tiers where I'll teach you to paint or I'll paint you something, as well as to all of our merch. At the moment, all of our merch is done through Fourth Wall and is all print on demand. Time for a little head. And if you're giggling at that, you're my kind of person. Sometimes people struggle jumping between shapes, and especially even if it's the same recipe, but all you're really doing is the exact same approach in a slightly different way. For example, we already have our recipe, we know how we're going to build our layers, and we know what goes in what order. We also know where highlights go. Highlights go on the highest points. Wherever the light's going to be the most intense, that's where a highlight goes. Don't stress about it, just start painting circles instead of lines. That's it. Now here's the part that I was truly conflicted with. With plate mail metal, I'm just going to start base coating the crest, the knife, all the fancy shiny parts. And honestly, after this step, it looked pretty badass. If you wanted to leave it silver, I would 100% approve. With a sepia tone wash and a couple of speed paints, I'm just going to be going over the metallics just to make them look fancy. On any kind of flamer or anything with Inferno in the name, it's going to kind of look like muzzle burn, and that's awesome. You can use this in so many different places on so many different weapons, and it looks pretty badass. The only thing I can recommend is let each layer dry and then paint in the transitions. Trying to blend speed paint over metallics can be a bit of a pain in the ass, so just let it dry, go over later with a couple of thinner coats. And because I am the way I am, I also decided to try this on the crest. For this, I treated each wing and the skull separately, so the same order, same layers, is just, repeat that on each part. As it stands, this is a tabletop standard. If you wanted to go in and glaze those layers, this thing would come out absolutely badass. As always, thank you to InGames, The Army Painter, everybody on the Patreon, and everybody that watches these videos. See you next week.